I was just there to paint her house, but when her sister asked me to stay, nothing stayed the same. The morning air was crisp as I pulled up to her house, the kind of quiet suburban street that made you feel the world had slowed down just enough to notice the small things, the way sunlight dappled the driveway, the faint scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the earthy aroma of morning dew. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, a mix of excitement and nerves. I wasn't just here to paint walls. I was entering a space that belonged to someone who, even before I'd met her, felt larger than life. She opened the door before I could even knock, and I was immediately struck. She was in her early 40s, gracefully poised, yet there was a softness in her presence that made the moment feel intimate rather than imposing. Her hair, just brushing her shoulders, caught the sunlight in subtle highlights, and the way she smiled, warm, unassuming, and slightly teasing, made me catch my breath without realizing it. She had a confident air, but it wasn't the kind that demanded attention. It was the kind that quietly drew you in, leaving you aware of every small movement, every tilt of her head, every flicker of emotion in her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle, with just enough playfulness to make me instantly at ease. She handed me a cup of coffee before I even asked, the mug warm between my hands. Our fingers brushed, and I felt a jolt, not shocking, just that subtle, magnetic pull that made a casual touch feel electric. I cleared my throat, pretending to examine the paintbrushes laid out on the porch, but my eyes kept returning to her. The sunlight played across her face, highlighting the soft lines around her eyes, the evidence of a life fully lived, and I found myself both mesmerized and intimidated. As I set up my ladder and paint, I noticed little details that made her presence linger in my thoughts. The way she moved around her home was unhurried but precise, a careful choreography of gestures that seemed effortless. When she spoke to me, even about trivial matters like which wall needed a second coat, I found myself listening not just to her words, but to the rhythm of her voice, the subtle warmth underlying every sentence. It was the kind of attentiveness that made you notice things you normally wouldn't, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the earthy smell of the house, the gentle rustle of her sweater when she leaned forward to point at a spot on the wall. There were pauses too, moments when we simply stood near each other, paintbrushes in hand, eyes meeting and holding just long enough to feel the electricity of unspoken recognition. I caught the way her gaze lingered slightly longer than necessary, how a soft smile would curl at the corners of her mouth when our hands accidentally brushed again. There was nothing overt, no words spoken, no gestures forced, but the tension was there, palpable in the quiet, in the small acts of proximity that felt charged with possibility. By the time I finished preparing the paints, I realized that the day was already unfolding in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was here to work on walls, yet somehow, the real task had become deciphering the quiet language of her presence, her glances, her gestures, and that unspoken invitation in the way she moved around her home. Painting a house had never felt like stepping into an intricate, delicate dance, but with her, it did. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning hum of the house was steady, a gentle backdrop to the rhythm of my paintbrush against the wall. I was focused on the task, but my mind kept drifting toward her graceful movements, the way sunlight danced across her hair, and the warmth in her smile that seemed to linger in the air long after she had moved away. I was so absorbed in this quiet fascination that the sudden sound of the front door opening made me start slightly. Her sister stepped in, a lively contrast to the calm elegance of the older woman. Younger, energetic, with a mischievous glint in her eyes, she carried herself with a casual confidence that immediately shifted the energy of the room. "Hey," she said, looking between me and her sister. "This looks productive. Could you stay after for a bit? I could use a hand with something." I froze for a fraction of a second, caught off guard. It was a simple request on the surface, but the undercurrent was undeniable, a subtle invitation that immediately sent a rush of heat through me. I hesitated, aware of social boundaries, aware of the age gap, aware of the tension that was already quietly humming in the room. And then I noticed her, the older woman, standing just a few steps away. She was watching, her expression calm but thoughtful, almost like she was assessing the moment with careful consideration. Her eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, and I felt a curious mix of reassurance and heightened self-awareness. Sure, I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt. I can help. Her sister's grin widened, and she left with a casual wave, leaving the room quieter, yet charged in a different way. The moment we were alone, I felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. She walked over, carrying a small stack of papers, and handed them to me. Our hands brushed, briefly, and I could sense the electricity in that fleeting contact. She didn't pull away immediately, allowing the moment to linger just long enough for it to be noticed, acknowledged, but not defined. We worked side by side, painting and straightening, our conversation light but layered. She asked questions about my life, my ambitions, casually probing yet maintaining a delicate intimacy. I noticed the way her eyes softened when she smiled, the subtle movements of her hands as she brushed hair away from her face, the quiet elegance of her posture as she leaned to inspect a wall. Each detail felt magnified, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us addressed directly. There were pauses too, comfortable, almost meditative moments where our eyes met and held, and the unspoken question of what if hovered in the space between us. My heart would pick up in those seconds, and I could tell she noticed, even as her expression remained composed. It was a dance of glances and gestures, small but full of meaning, the tilt of her head, the faint laugh lines that deepened as she chuckled at something I said, the warmth in her voice that seemed to resonate just for me. By the time the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting the room in gold and shadow, I realized that the sister's request had done more than extend my day. It had shifted everything. The quiet rhythm of work, the subtle glances, the unspoken awareness of each other, it all felt like the first step into a connection I hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. Painting a house had started as a job, but now it was shaping into something far more intricate, the delicate, electric beginning of a slow, undeniable pull between us. By mid-afternoon, the house had settled into a quiet rhythm. The faint smell of paint mingled with the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee she had brought me earlier, creating a strangely comforting cocoon around us. I worked on the corner of the living room wall while she moved gently around the space, organizing things and occasionally glancing in my direction. Each look felt deliberate yet effortless, as if she were aware of how much I noticed and perhaps enjoyed it silently. There was something about the quiet intimacy of shared space that made time stretch. We didn't speak constantly, but every pause seemed meaningful. She handed me a cloth to wipe a drip from the wall, and our fingers brushed briefly. That fleeting touch sent a ripple of awareness through me, not from lust, but from a raw, human closeness. She noticed it too. I could see the flicker of something unspoken in her eyes, a subtle acknowledgement that we were both aware of the electric tension between us. The conversation, when it came, was light, almost casual, but layered with quiet meaning. She asked about my family, my studies, and my plans for the summer, listening intently to my answers. And though I tried to keep my focus on the painting, I found myself noticing every small movement she made, the way her sleeves brushed her wrists, the tilt of her head when she thought, the faint smile that accompanied her laughter. I realized that I wasn't just observing her, I was absorbing her presence, letting it anchor me in a way that felt new and quietly intoxicating. A small moment of vulnerability revealed itself when she spoke of a personal memory, something trivial yet intimate, about a past project she had worked on. Her voice softened, her eyes momentarily distant, and I sensed the trust she extended simply by sharing it with me. I didn't respond with anything profound, just listened, fully present, offering my attention as a kind of silent support. In that moment, I felt the emotional connection deepen, not through words, but through acknowledgement, empathy, and shared presence. Physical closeness began to take on a new significance. At one point, she leaned over to adjust a paint tray, her shoulder brushing mine. I didn't step back. I let the contact linger for just a heartbeat longer than normal, aware of the warmth and subtle electricity of proximity. We continued working, side by side, the small touches accumulating into a gentle rhythm. It was an unspoken dance of awareness and restraint, body language communicating more than words ever could. The sunlight through the window highlighted the soft contours of her face, and I found myself stealing glances when she wasn't looking. Her attention, though mostly focused on her tasks, occasionally met mine, and in those seconds, an understanding passed silently between us. Neither of us acted on it, yet the tension was undeniable. By the end of the afternoon, it was clear that this was no longer just about painting. The shared space, the small touches, the layered conversation, and the quiet observation had created a foundation for something far more intimate. Something emotional and unspoken was growing between us, a connection that was neither rushed nor forced, but slow, deliberate, and deeply magnetic. And though the workday continued, I couldn't help but feel that the most important thing we were building wasn't on the walls at all. It was between us. By the late afternoon, the room had taken on a warm, golden hue as sunlight filtered through the curtains. The walls we had been painting glowed softly in the fading light, but neither of us seemed to notice much beyond the small, intimate bubble that had formed between us. We had finished most of the work for the day, leaving time to sit quietly in the living room with mugs of tea she had thoughtfully prepared. The quiet clink of ceramic and the gentle hiss of steam rising from the mugs seemed almost louder than the outside world, emphasizing the delicate intimacy of the moment. We sat across from each other, comfortably close, but not intrusively so. She smiled at something I said, and the simple curve of her lips made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Her hands, wrapped around the warm mug, were graceful yet strong, and I found myself noticing the way her fingers flexed around it, how her wedding ring, or lack thereof, caught the sunlight. I wanted to reach out, to let my hand brush against hers, but hesitation held me back. There was a tension between us that had been growing slowly, like a thread being pulled taut, and it was both thrilling and terrifying. Our conversation drifted naturally into more personal territory. She spoke of small regrets and quiet joys, the kinds of stories people only share when they feel safe. I listened intently, captivated not by the stories themselves, but by the way she shared them, the subtle shifts in her tone, the sparkle in her eyes when she remembered something fondly, the brief shadow that passed when she mentioned moments of vulnerability. I felt honored by her trust, and it deepened my admiration for her in ways that went beyond surface attraction. For my part, I shared glimpses of my own life, my fears and ambitions, careful not to overshare, yet hoping to convey sincerity. She listened with that patient, quiet attentiveness that made me feel understood and accepted. There was no need to impress her. The connection was built on authenticity. I noticed her posture relax as I spoke, the faint leaning forward that indicated genuine interest, and it made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name, a mix of longing and comfort. Then came a pause, a silence so full it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. I almost reached across the space between us to brush a stray lock of hair from her face, a simple gesture that suddenly felt monumental. She caught my gaze and held it, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Would we bridge the distance, or respect the invisible line that separated curiosity from action? Neither of us moved, but the shared awareness made the moment electric. Even without words, we communicated volumes in those quiet minutes. A small smile, a subtle nod, the way our hands occasionally brushed against the mugs, every gesture was amplified by the unspoken tension. I realized that this afternoon had shifted everything. It was no longer about walls, paint, or chores. It was about noticing, acknowledging, and appreciating each other in a way that was tender, respectful, and quietly charged with desire. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, I felt something profound take root, an emotional connection that neither of us could ignore. The slow burn of attraction was no longer hypothetical. It was tangible, threaded through every glance, every pause, and every carefully measured word. And in that soft, amber light, it felt as if the world had contracted to just the two of us, suspended in a fragile, beautiful intimacy. The afternoon had quietly surrendered to early evening, and the house was bathed in a warm, golden glow that seemed to soften every edge. The smell of fresh paint lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the subtle scent of her perfume, a delicate, floral hint that lingered in the space around her. I had been cleaning up supplies, and she was adjusting a curtain when a sudden spill of paint on the floor broke the calm rhythm. Without thinking, I bent to help her, my hand brushing hers as we simultaneously reached for the cloth. That simple, accidental contact sent a ripple through me, sharp, immediate, impossible to ignore. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and for the briefest moment, the world outside the room ceased to exist. The brush of our fingers lingered just a heartbeat too long, and though neither of us said anything, the tension that had been quietly building all day now hummed loudly between us. We straightened, faces inches apart, and I noticed details I hadn't allowed myself to focus on before. The way her breath caught slightly when our hands met, the soft curve of her jaw, the warmth radiating from her as she leaned toward me. Every instinct told me to step back, to respect the invisible boundary, yet I remained rooted, drawn into the silent gravity of her presence. Her expression was unreadable, a careful blend of curiosity, amusement, and something softer, something that hinted at the vulnerability she had carefully guarded until now. She didn't move away, and that choice, subtle as it was, spoke louder than any words could. It was as if we had both reached the edge of something unspoken, teetering between desire and restraint, aware of the fragility of the moment and choosing to honor it silently. The air between us felt charged, alive with anticipation. I became acutely aware of her subtle movements, the tilt of her head, the slight flex of her fingers, the way her eyes lingered on mine just long enough to communicate acknowledgement without crossing the line. Every second stretched, suspended in quiet intensity, the kind of moment that can alter a connection forever. We continued cleaning up, but the simple act of moving around each other felt intimate. Our shoulders brushed lightly, our proximity too close to ignore, yet entirely appropriate. Each accidental touch, each shared glance, reinforced the unspoken understanding growing between us. It was no longer casual, it was a silent acknowledgement of attraction, curiosity, and a deepening emotional bond. Even as the room quieted and the spill was cleaned, the tension remained. Neither of us acted impulsively, yet both were acutely aware of the new dynamic forming between us. The emotional stakes had shifted. We were no longer just employer and painter, or older woman and younger man. We had become two people navigating a delicate balance of desire, respect, and mutual fascination. By the time we paused and stepped back to admire our work, the unspoken desire lingered like a soft hum in the air. Every glance, every slight touch, and every shared silence had layered our connection, building towards something neither of us could name yet fully understood. The slow burn that had started the moment I stepped into her house had reached a new peak, an unspoken tension, potent and electrifying, ready to guide the next step of our journey together. The day had begun to wind down, the house now quiet except for the faint hum of distant traffic and the soft creak of floorboards as we moved about. The paintbrushes were rinsed, trays stacked neatly, and the walls finally gleamed with the finishing touches of our work. But the true transformation hadn't happened on the walls, it had unfolded subtly in the space between us. The tension, once electric and unspoken, had softened into a delicate, warm awareness that made every glance and gesture carry meaning. We moved into the living room, carrying mugs of tea she had thoughtfully brewed, the aroma mingling with the fading scent of paint. We sat on the couch side by side, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, yet giving each other enough space to maintain comfort. The golden light of the late afternoon filtered through the curtains, highlighting the soft contours of her face and the gentle depth in her eyes. I realized, almost suddenly, how natural it felt to be near her, how my heart slowed when she laughed, and how every subtle movement she made seemed amplified by the quiet intimacy of the moment. She handed me a mug, and our fingers brushed briefly longer than it had earlier, just enough to let the warmth linger. I noticed the softness of her skin, the subtle tension in her hand, and the silent invitation in her eyes. She smiled, a small, knowing smile that hinted she was aware of the undercurrent that had built throughout the day. Words felt almost unnecessary, yet the need to break the silence gently became irresistible. I I really enjoyed today, I said, my voice low and sincere. Not just painting, but spending time with you. The words felt honest and slightly vulnerable, a confession in their simplicity. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening, and responded in kind. I enjoyed it too. It's been nice having someone around who notices the small things. The conversation flowed naturally after that, light but meaningful, filled with laughter and subtle moments of shared understanding. We spoke of ordinary things, favorite books, music, past experiences, but each topic carried an undertone of connection, of genuine curiosity about each other's lives. There was no rush, no need to escalate what had been carefully built over the day. The intimacy was in the shared presence, the small gestures, the quiet smiles exchanged across the couch. At one point, she brushed a strand of hair from her face, and I instinctively leaned slightly closer, not enough to cross boundaries, but enough that our closeness became palpable. She didn't move away, allowing the subtle contact to linger. In that brief, almost imperceptible moment, something shifted between us, a mutual acknowledgement of attraction, tempered by respect, patience, and understanding. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long, soft shadows across the room, I realized that our connection had moved beyond the unspoken tension of earlier hours. We had crossed into a space where emotions were recognized, desires acknowledged, and boundaries respected. The slow burn had transformed into a gentle flame of possibility, an emotional intimacy that neither of us wanted to rush, yet one that was undeniably present. By the time I prepared to leave for the day, there was a quiet certainty between us. She offered a hand on my shoulder, lingering just a moment longer than necessary, and I felt the warmth of her touch resonate deep within me. There was no need for grand gestures, the acknowledgement of our feelings, the unspoken promise of future moments together, and the shared understanding that had formed in the span of a single day were enough. The emotional resolution had begun, not a culmination, but a tender opening into what could become something meaningful, slow, and profoundly human. The evening had settled over the neighborhood, and the house was now cloaked in the soft shadows of twilight. The walls, freshly painted, reflected the warm glow of the last slivers of sunlight slipping through the windows. The workday was over, but neither of us moved immediately. Instead, we lingered in the quiet aftermath of a day that had shifted something subtle yet profound between us. There was an energy in the room, a delicate tension that had softened into something tender, something quietly intimate. She stood by the doorway, her posture relaxed but deliberate, and I found myself noticing the curve of her shoulders, the gentle strength in her stance, and the quiet elegance that seemed effortless yet magnetic. I could smell the lingering hint of her perfume, a subtle floral that had become a constant companion throughout the day. The air between us carried the weight of unspoken acknowledgement, and my chest tightened in anticipation of what would happen next. I should probably head out, I said, my voice low, careful not to rush the moment. She nodded, her eyes meeting mine, and the silence that followed spoke volumes. There was a pause, a shared understanding of all that had passed between us, the brushes of hands, the lingering glances, the quiet conversations that had revealed pieces of ourselves we didn't show everyone. It was a slow, careful build toward something neither of us had named aloud, yet it was undeniable. She stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. The touch was gentle, deliberate, and full of warmth, the kind of contact that lingers in memory long after it ends. Our eyes met, and in that gaze was everything we hadn't said: curiosity, admiration, a hint of longing, and the quiet recognition of a bond that had formed unexpectedly yet irrevocably. I felt the same, the pull, the fascination, the deepening connection that had grown over the course of the day. We lingered in a simple embrace, just long enough for our proximity to feel natural, safe, and significant. It was the kind of hug that spoke of mutual respect, of unspoken promises, and of the acknowledgement that this was only the beginning of something meaningful. Her hand on my back, the subtle warmth of her body, and the faint scent of her hair all created a moment suspended in time, intimate, tender, and YouTube safe. Pulling back slightly, she smiled, a soft, genuine curve that carried reassurance and subtle invitation. "I'm glad you stayed," she said quietly. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was profound. Recognition of shared experience, acknowledgement of emotional connection, and the subtle promise of more to come. I nodded, words unnecessary. The smile I returned carried all the sincerity and hope I felt. As I stepped toward the door, we shared a final glance, lingering just long enough for hearts to communicate what words could not. I left with the warmth of her presence etched into memory, the gentle touch of her hand, the softness in her voice, and the quiet understanding that we had crossed a threshold. The day had begun as a simple task of painting walls, but it ended with something far more enduring, a deep emotional bond, mutual acknowledgement of attraction, and the tender opening of a slow-burn romance neither of us would forget. Walking away, I felt a strange combination of excitement and calm, knowing that we had taken the first steps together, not rushed, not forced, but carefully, delicately, and with the promise of more to explore. The emotional resolution wasn't about conclusions or declarations. It was about connection, trust, and the quiet understanding that what had begun today was only the beginning of something profound and human.